When we think about priests in the Bible, most people probably think about Aaron and his sons and the generations after them who were offering sacrifices in the tabernacle and later offering sacrifices in the temple, the lambs and the goats and the bulls being killed and the blood being thrown around. At least for me, that's the image that most readily comes to my mind. But I hope that you've already come to see throughout the sermons that we've been preaching on the priesthood this year, I hope that you've already come to see that the role of priests is much larger than Aaron and his family. Priests are those people who represent God to humanity. And they're the people who take care of God's sacred space. And there have been people doing that in the Bible long before Moses came along and built the tabernacle, long before Aaron and his descendants would serve inside of it. When we get to the point in the Bible where Aaron's sons are serving in the temple, when we get down to the period of the kings, for instance, where David and Solomon and their descendants after them are reigning in the land of Judah, and you have the Levites serving in the temple, when we get to that point in the Bible, there are very clearly different roles in Israelites' society that we find fitting into nice, neat boxes. And what I mean by that is if you look at the way that Israelite society, the nation of Israel, is structured, on the one hand, you have the kings. And the kings are the political leaders in Israel. And on the other hand, you have the priests. And those are the religious leaders in Israel. And when we get to that era where the priests and the kings are coexisting in Israel, they both have a job to do, it becomes very clear to us that there's not supposed to be overlap between the two. Because when we find kings like Saul going and trying to offer sacrifices, he's punished for it. You don't do what the priests do. Saul, you're a king. Stay in your lane. After all, the priests come from the tribe of Levi. The kings come from the tribe of Judah. Both roles are supposed to be distinct and separate in the Israelite nations. But this isn't the way it was always supposed to be. There wasn't always supposed to be such a clear distinction between the kings and the priests. This isn't the way it always was. And one of the places that we are most jarringly reminded of this is in the obscure story of a man named Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14. Let's go over to Genesis chapter 14, if you haven't already opened there with me. Genesis chapter 14, and I just want to read to you the very brief story of Melchizedek as it's recorded in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 14, beginning in verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." He gave him a tenth of all. That's it. That's the story of Melchizedek. Just a few verses. And as quickly as he comes on the scene, he leaves the scene. But we need to talk a little bit about this guy, especially if we're going to understand the priesthood in the Bible. Let's talk about his story for just a minute. It is a brief story, but to fully appreciate the things we just read about Melchizedek coming along and blessing Abram, and to understand Melchizedek offering him this banquet, this feast of bread and wine, to understand and fully appreciate Melchizedek's actions, we need to understand the story that is being told where these actions take place. And by the way, this is probably not one of those stories in the book of Genesis that we're likely to read in one of our children's Bible story books, but it's a great story in the book of Genesis nonetheless. Back in Genesis chapter 13, Abram and his nephew Lot became so wealthy, you may remember, they became so wealthy, amassed so much livestock, so many servants, so many people with them, that they could not physically stay together any longer. There was contention among their servants, among the people working for them, and so they couldn't stay together any longer. And so Abram, back in chapter 13, Abram recommended that they separate and that they do so cordially. Listen, let's not fight, let's not bicker, let's go our separate ways. You pick which way you want to go, and I'll go the other way. Lot could have chosen any direction to have traveled, and Abram agreed that he would go the other way to keep peace between their families, between their livestock, between their servants. In chapter 13, Lot saw that the land in the valley was good, and so he moved near to the city called Sodom. But we're ominously warned in chapter 13, verse 13, that the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. Now that Abram and Lot are separated, when we turn the page to Genesis 14, we are dropped into the middle of a multinational war between 9 kings. If there's such a thing as a world war in the ancient world, I imagine it would probably look something like this. Because there are 4 kings from the east. If I had a map, I would point you towards the region where we would often label something like Babylon or Assyria. Those nations weren't around at this time, but these 4 kings from the east are coming from that territory, and they are coming to fight against 5 kings from in and around Canaan. And we read about these kings. You can see all their names at the beginning of chapter 14 in the book of Genesis. And there is a brief description in Genesis 14 of this intense battle. And we shouldn't make any mistake about it. This battle involving these 9 kings is a big time. These are big time kings coming and duking it out. This is not some small skirmish. This is a major military conflict. But the whole reason this battle is significant to the Bible story, like if you're just reading, like we read about the separation of Abram and Lot, and all of a sudden we're reading about these kings that we've never heard of, we don't know who they are or where they're from, you ask yourself, well, why is this so significant to the story of Abram and Lot? Why are we learning about these kings' battles? The whole reason this battle is significant to the Bible story is that the king of Sodom, his name was Barah. In verse 2, the king of Sodom ran away. We read about this in verse 10. He ran away from these 4 kings from the east, and he fell into a tar pit. Now the problem is, that's the king of Lot now, because Lot moved to Sodom. And because of this defeat, those 4 kings from the east, verse 11 and 12 says, if you're following along, these 4 kings from the east took all the goods of Sodom. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions, and they departed, for he was living in Sodom. And when these foreign kings took Lot captive, Abram got involved. When you look at verses 13 through 16, it says, Then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. He was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. This is fascinating. We don't often think about Abraham like this, but Abraham has trained men under his supervision, these trained men who are ready for war, 318 of them. And Abram takes these men and he goes out to do battle against these 4 major kings from the east. We don't often think about Abraham as a powerful military leader, but that's exactly what he does here. He proves himself to be a military leader. He proves himself to be more effective than all of these kings, all of the 9 kings from the east and from Canaan, and apparently as powerful as any of them. This is what it says in verse 15. Abram divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions and also the women and the people. So Abram runs his own private rescue mission, defeats these 4 kings, brings back all of the stolen goods, and rescues Lot from his captors. Wow. I don't often think about Abraham like that. After this rescue mission, on his way back home, Abram meets 2 kings outside of a city that we know best as Jerusalem. He's on his way back home. He's traveling with all of Sodom's goods, all of the spoil from the victory of the 4 kings. He's got Lot in tow, and he passes by the city that we now know as Jerusalem, and he meets 2 kings. First, he meets the king of Sodom. He meets the king of Sodom outside of Jerusalem. Verse 17 says it was in the King's Valley, which is a place later on in the Bible will be described as being outside Jerusalem. And the king of Sodom is only concerned about taking his people, who Abram saved from the 4 kings. But Abram also meets another king, one who hasn't been involved in this war at all. We've met a lot of kings. I haven't mentioned all of their names to you, but we've met a lot of kings. We've met 9 kings total, but we meet a 10th king here who has not been involved at all in this war, a king named Melchizedek. And that's when Melchizedek blesses Abram with a celebratory meal and a blessing from God. So, who is this king? And why are we just now meeting him? And why are his actions so important and significant? There's a lot of interesting ideas about Melchizedek's identity. Some people think that Melchizedek here is an angel, come down from heaven to interact with Abram in this moment. Some interpreters throughout history have believed that this is Jesus himself, sort of a pre-incarnate Christ, they'll say. Jesus, before he came to earth in the virgin birth, maybe this is Jesus himself come to interact with Abram here. Others have supposed that he might be a very, very old Shem. That's Adam and Eve's son, Shem. Noah's son. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, excuse me. Noah's son, Shem. Some have suggested that he's Shem here, a very old Shem. I don't think we need to pursue any sort of supernatural explanation for Melchizedek. But one of the reasons so many strange ideas have surfaced about his identity is because the text is so sparse on details. There is a lot of room to hypothesize about who this might be because the text does not give us a lot of answers to the kinds of questions that we often want it to answer. There's a lot of room for us to come up with our own ideas. Let me just point out a few things that the text does say about Melchizedek. First, Melchizedek is a name we know in Hebrew that means king of righteousness. King of righteousness. By the way, the Hebrews writer in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 2 translates that for us. So if you don't know Hebrew, you can just trust the Hebrews writer. He says this man's name means king of righteousness. That's one thing I'd point out to you about this man. The second thing I'd observe about Melchizedek, right here from Genesis chapter 14, is that Melchizedek is, verse 18 says, the king of Salem. Salem is a word that in Hebrew means peace. So he is, in one sense, the king of a city named Salem, but maybe he is also a king that is characterized by peace. You know, there were 9 kings that went to battle here in the story in Genesis 14. He did not go. He was the lone king in this story that did not go to war, but chose peace. In the future, this city's name would be lengthened to Jerusalem, And that's why we know this to be the city that we call it by that name. So, long before David made Jerusalem his capital city, long before Joshua conquered the land, there was a king in Jerusalem whose name was Righteousness. Third observation from the text about Melchizedek is that he is also, verse 18 says, a priest of God Most High. Of course, that's why he's significant for our study here, is this idea that he is a priest of God Most High. One striking thing about Melchizedek is that even though he is not a part of Abraham's family, he clearly seems to be serving Yahweh. Although he doesn't call him Yahweh, he knows Yahweh as El Elyon, God Most High. But this statement about his priestly role is odd to me, because it's almost made as a passing observation. He's the king of Salem. Oh, and he's also the priest of God Most High. You may remember that this is the first time that anyone is called a priest in the Bible. For those of us who are familiar with the way that the Israelites did things, this might seem strange. Because if we have in our minds the way that the Israelites do things, then we have in our minds the idea that kings and priests are supposed to be separate roles in a society. And yet, like it's nothing at all, Melchizedek is said so matter-of-factly to fill both, to be both a king and a priest simultaneously. He does both jobs. This is not an insignificant story. There is a lot to say about Melchizedek's significance. And by the way, I hope that you're not too disappointed, but I have no intention of saying everything about his significance in this lesson. There is some way in which Melchizedek will become a prototype of the Messianic king. Melchizedek is mentioned later in Psalm 110, verse 4, but I don't have the time or interest to talk to you about that yet. Hebrews chapter 5, 6, and 7 will detail ways in which Jesus is like Melchizedek. All of that's important, but we're not to that point in the Bible's story yet about the priesthood. For now, I want to highlight one important, significant feature about biblical priests that we see clearly in the brief story of Melchizedek. And that is this: Yahweh's priests are supposed to be kings. Melchizedek is introduced as a king and a priest simultaneously. But those roles aren't as distinct as we might imagine. In fact, the text in Genesis 14 can mention this detail so casually because this is apparently the way things were supposed to be. When Melchizedek, the king priest, came to Abram, Abram didn't say, "Wait a minute, you've got it all wrong, you've got to pick one." Abram understood, of course, he's a king and a priest. Who wouldn't be? If you want another example of a priestly king, look no further than Abram himself in this story. He is a kingly ruler over his family and his servants. Abram acts with greater integrity, power, strength, and cunning than any of the other 9 kings in the battle. Abram is the greatest king in the story. Maybe second only to Melchizedek. But he also simultaneously serves his family as a patriarchal priest. He builds altars. He offers sacrifices. But the idea that one person could serve as both a priest and a king goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were the first priests of Yahweh. If you've been studying with me throughout this series, you should not be surprised by that statement. Adam and Eve were the first priests in God's first sacred space on earth. They were tasked with the job of taking care of that sacred space. They were to intercede between God and creation. They were to be the image bearer of God. But I want you to listen to a couple of other things that are said about them in the creation story. So I'm going back to Genesis chapter 1 now. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." That is priestly language. The idea that Adam and Eve are going to represent God to creation is to say that they're going to be priests. They're going to live and function as priests in the world. They're going to reflect who God is to everything around them. But that's not all that God says about them. He says they're going to be in my image. Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule. They're kings. They're not just priests. They're not just servants of God. They are servants of God, but not merely servants of God. They rule with God, alongside him. A few verses down, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28 continues the account of their creation. And when they're created, God turns to them and tells Adam and Eve to fill the earth and to subdue it and rule. The role of a priest, that is to say, being a representative of Yahweh, includes the responsibility of ruling alongside the King of Kings. To exert God's righteous rule in creation and to expand the peace of God throughout the world. That was Adam and Eve's job. That's what Adam and Eve failed to do in Genesis chapter 3. But for a moment, in this brief, obscure story in Genesis 14, we meet a king of righteousness who serves as a priest of God in the city of peace. Yahweh has always had his priesthood. Adam and Eve were intended to serve that priestly role. And despite their failure, Yahweh has never been without his representatives on earth. And so in the midst of this war in Genesis 14, with 9 worldly, self-absorbed, godless, and sinful kings, Melchizedek stands out as a righteous priest of God. At least in this moment, he does what even Adam and Eve failed to do. At least in this moment, Yahweh was represented in the city of Jerusalem by a priest and king who ruled like Yahweh. By the time the nation of Israel rolls around much later in the Bible, the priesthood and the kingship are 2 completely different roles. And there are some fascinating and sobering reasons for that. But the goal has always been for humanity to return to the system as it was intended in the Garden of Eden, where humanity serves God as both priest and king, as both representative of God's image and a representation of his rule and authority in the world. Maybe as we continue to read the Bible, we'll see someone who will be a priest like Melchizedek. Wouldn't that be nice? Maybe, if we continue to read in the Bible, we'll discover how all of God's people can someday, maybe, be called a royal priesthood. But in this moment today, you have a choice to make. God has created you as his image bearer. You have been made in the image of God to reflect him. Are you serving as a priest in that way? Are you reflecting the image of God to all creation around you? Are you sharing in the rule of God as you extend his authority and his kingdom to everyone you interact with? If you need help with that, if you need help getting started with that process, we would love to talk with you. We'd love to study with you and help you see how you are designed by God to represent him, to bear his image. If we can help serve you in that way today, why don't you come and let us know what we can do as we stand and sing a song of encouragement together.